devastating impact on Palestinians has threatened to spill over into neighboring countries, with the potential of turning it into a regional conflict. The war has exposed several potential flashpoints in the region. One of them is Syria. With recent airstrikes on civilian targets inside the country that have been attributed to Israel, what are the risks of serious miscalculation? Could it lead to a full-fledged regional war? After years of political stalemate in Syria, what are the prospects for renewed diplomatic engagement? Are all stakeholders ready to move towards the implementation of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254, which has been passed unanimously by the Security Council back in 2015, and which calls for a credible and genuine and inclusive political process in Syria? Can the Syrian opposition unite over a common goal? How will the changing dynamics on the ground and the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation affect the already tense situation? With an estimated 70% of Syria's territory under his control, active Russian support and renewed ties with Arab nations, does Bashar al-Assad today have the upper hand? How does the presence of non-Syrian forces in the country further complicate the situation? Now, while Syria's military continues to fight Islamist militant groups in the northwest and Kurdish-dominated forces control most of the northeast, the United States maintains over 900 military personnel inside the country, and Turkey has a significant presence as well in the north. Is there a path towards peace and reconstruction? Is there a national consensus? And is there an international, regional roadmap for the way forward? What does it look like? I'm joined by several key actors here on stage with me today, representing different forces both on the national, regional, and global levels. Let me begin, as any discussion about conflicts often does, with the United Nations and Geir Pedersen. Geir Pedersen, you have been the Special Envoy of the United Nations Secretary General for Syria since October 2018, I believe longer than anyone else has been in the job. I remember back when Kofi Annan, who took on the job as the first Special Envoy for Syria, resigned after less than 6 months. He said it was mission impossible, but he did say as well that, like him, there were many other crazy people in the world, and that no doubt eventually someone else would take up the role. And a few people did. Lakhdar Brahimi tried, so did Staffan de Mistura. They both tried, failed, and gave up. Yet here you are. You've been at it for more than 6 years. There has been a political stalemate for the last few, certainly since 2020. How frustrated are you about the lack of progress on the political front, and just how concerned are you about the potential of a spillover from the Israeli war on Gaza?
Thank you so much, and I think it was a very good introduction to all the challenges we are indeed facing. And to start with a very direct answer to your question, I'm extremely frustrated, as I should be, because we are not making any progress. The reality is that, we need to remember that half the pre-war population of Syria left their homes. Half the pre-war population left their homes. And they're still not back in their homes. And while we are struggling with that alone, all the other indicators are pointing in the wrong direction. And I repeat, all indicators are pointing in the wrong direction. Politically, as you rightly alluded to, we are not making any progress. Economically, and with the humanitarian crisis, the economic challenges are enormous, and all the economic indicators are always also pointing in the wrong direction. And as Hadi will be saying later, while the humanitarian needs are increasing, the international support decreasing. And then we have the security situation that you mentioned, and there are two aspects to that. One is directly linked to what you mentioned, the war in Gaza, and we already see a spillover into Syria from the war in Gaza. We already see it, and we can go into some details if you want to do that. But then we also need to remember it's not only the spillover from Gaza. The one thing that's taking the most life in Syria today is not the spillover of the conflict from Gaza, but it is the intra-Syrian conflict. We have more or less on a daily basis shelling from Idlib into government-controlled areas and the other way around. And we have still a lot of problems in the northeast. And we have Daesh still roaming around and creating a lot of challenges. Maybe just one more thing before we move on. Last year, after the terrible earthquake that struck Turkey and Syria, there was suddenly a lot of hope. We saw Arabs reaching out to Damascus. We saw Turkey reaching out to Damascus. And it created an impression that political, economic, and security progress was possible. But what have we seen during the last year is that the Arab rapprochement hasn't led to anything. The Turkish Damascus hasn't led to anything. And we have a stalemate in the political process. This and the economic and security challenges has created even more despair in Syria, and this is the challenge.
And so given all of this, why isn't the United Nations more invested in this crisis? I mean, why isn't Syria being given the priority it deserves, given the fact that you've got so many potential flashpoints, not just domestically, internally, but in addition to what could happen, and is already happening by way of airstrikes that you yourself have attributed to Israel inside Syria,
yes,
on civilian
yes,
infrastructure, including the airports in Aleppo and Damascus over the last few months. Last December, you presented a report to the UN Security Council in which you warned that violence, as you say now, has been spiraling out of control throughout Syria in a conflict that you say should not be left unattended. You told the Council that there was an urgent need for maximum restraint by all actors, Syrian and non-Syrian. Who do you mean? And who needs to be restrained? And above all, why aren't you doing more?
I think let's be very clear. The UN is many different things. We have the UN is the Security Council with 15 members, 5, as you all know, 5 with veto rights in the Council. Then we have the General Assembly, which is also active on the Syrian file. I can go into some details on that. Then we have the UN funds and programs. Development, humanitarian assistance, the World Health Organization, and all of these things. Then we have the Secretariat, with the Secretary General at the top, and with different envoys around. For the envoys to be effective, it goes without saying, we of course need the cooperation of the Security Council, and first and foremost, its permanent members. We have, in theory, we have a consensus when it comes to Syria, and you mentioned it in your introduction. Security Council Resolution 2254 that was adopted in December 2015. But what has happened since December 2015, a lot of different things. We have seen an increased Russian role, an increased Iranian role. We have seen American presence, American claiming they're fighting Daesh. We have seen increased Israeli attacks. And now we are seeing clashes between Jordan and smuggling activities in Syria. And the whole drug aspect of it that we hasn't entered into. So my challenge is basically this, and this is also basically what I'm telling the Council every month. Listen, I'm saying, none of you sitting around this table can solve this conflict alone. And I, as the UN envoy, I can't solve it alone. And none of the Syrian parties can solve this alone. Not the opposition and not the government. You know, something has to give. You all have to start accepting that there needs to be a compromise. The Russians need to compromise, the Iranians need to compromise, Turkey needs to compromise, the United States needs to compromise, the government needs, and the opposition needs. My job, and it's become increasingly difficult after the war in Ukraine, is to bring all the parties together. I said from day number one that I need all of them around the table. They are not willing to sit around the table, but I deal with them bilaterally.
But what is the biggest obstacle, would you say, in the Security Council? Is it the United States? Let's face it. Is it Russia?
No, frankly speaking, I think they don't mention this in Washington. I think they're all the problem, including Washington. That's the tragedy of the Syrian conflict. Many of the issues in Syria can be solved by the Syrian parties, but there are too many issues in the Syrian conflict that cannot be solved by the Syrian parties alone. We need the United States, we need Turkey, we need Iran, and we need Russia. And as we all know, after the war in Ukraine, there's hardly any contact between Russia and Washington. But I'm appealing to them. I'm saying, listen, I understand all the difficulties you're having. I understand that Gaza is now taking all the attention. I understand that. But it is not in your interest to let the crisis in Syria continue to deteriorate. We saw what happened in Gaza. People believed, all the powers believed, that the Palestinian issue was dead. And there has been a tendency in the international community to believe that the Syrian crisis can be managed. You don't have to deal with it. It's too difficult. But I tell you, if we don't start dealing with it and all the different aspects of the crisis, it will come back to haunt us. That's the reality.
And you mentioned the word manage. It seems part of the problem is too many of the big powers are too busy managing the conflict as opposed to trying to resolve it. Given the complicated situation that you've just outlined, let me move on to Badr Jamous, who is president of the Syrian Negotiation Commission, which was established in 2015 to try to push things forward on the domestic front. I know that you've complained as well about the fact that too many crises around the world, obviously the war in Gaza, has diverted attention from the situation in Syria, as it has. Do you believe that Syria has been and is becoming increasingly a proxy war, something that is more and more difficult to resolve given all of the different stakes that different powers have? And what are you able to offer as the opposition? How much unity in the face of all of these different threats are you able to provide?
Thank you, Reda. Good morning, and good morning, everybody. To be frank, before Gaza and before Ukraine and before the COVID, we have the same situation, we have the same problem. The opposition, they accept the resolution 2118 from 2012, and we go to negotiation in 2014, and we was very flexible. We was really worried about Syria, about our people, and we put a paper on the table. But Ibrahim in that time, he see that the problem where it's in the regime. The regime from the beginning, he don't need any solution. So in 2015, we bring all the opposition under one umbrella. It's SNC. We have today all the opposition group under this umbrella, SNC. We go to negotiate again in Geneva, 3, 4, 5, 6, no result, because again, we don't have a partner. The Syrian regime, he don't want a solution in Syria. So I understand now what Mr. Geir is saying, but I think the UN, they are taking more responsibility for themselves. They are not going back to the Security Council and say, where's the problem? They have to show where is the problem. Today the problem, you cannot solve Northeast, Northwest, Al-Qaeda, Daesh without solve the problem with the government. The government, they don't need any solution. We are trying to do that in many places. In Astana, in Sochi, we go to the CC. So always we don't have a partner. So the problem is clear for us. It's not with the Russia, with the American today, with the Iranian, because we have other side, Syrian side, which he don't want to come to the table, and he don't want to have a solution in Syria. And this brings Syria, increase all the problem, drugs, terrorists, refugee, and it will be increased day by day. refugee today will be more and more from all Syria. No Syrian they want to stay in Syria today because they don't see future, they don't see hope in Syria. So what we will offer, or we already offer to the General Security, Mr. Guterres and Mr. Gare in New York last General Assembly, why the UN they are not inviting for international conference for Syria. They have to put this in the table and invite it, and who will refute this? They have to see this very clear. We have to solve the Syrian conflict. We can see today all the Middle East leading by militia. This problem started from the Syrian war from 2011 until today. So if we don't solve the Syrian conflict, you will not solve all the conflict in the region. So you have to start it from Syria. This is our view, our opinion. We are ready. We are always ready to come to the table. We are ready to negotiate in all the 2254. We're always asking the UN to open the other basket because just CC is not work alone. You have the governor, you have to talk about the election, you have to talk about the Constitution Committee, all this, you have to put it in the table and show who don't want to have solution in Syria.
And the problem sounds like there's a lot of passing the buck and blaming it on the other party. But do you have a strategy to move this forward? Because we often hear the United Nations say that this has to be a Syrian-led, Syrian-owned process. Can it be, or do you need the international community, quote unquote, to act, Arab governments who you've been in touch with? Can they push things forward if the opposition remains so deeply divided?
Yes, it's Syrian talks, but if you have one part of Syria, they want solution. They are coming to the table. They are trying. And the other side, they don't want now almost 13 years. They are refusing. They don't have a political solution.
But do you accept that Bashar al-Assad will have to be part of the solution? Are you willing to accept a negotiated, inclusive process?
We are negotiating with the regime. From 2013, 14, we are in the table. The representative of the Bashar al-Assad, he's in the table. But the idea, he don't want a solution. So he's coming to the table. From 2014, they came to the table. But they are coming to not make solution.
What is your view of the solution?
The view of solution, implement 2254, implement 2118. We have a resolution which was voting by the Security Council, all 15 members, and we accept this and we need to implement. So this idea, it's very clear, I think, and Russia, they say we need to implement 2254, the American, the Turk, the Arab, the Syrian opposition, but the question, where our partner, with who? The Syrian talks, with who? Today we are 2 years, we cannot make meeting of the CC because the regime, they don't want to come to the meeting, to Geneva, which was clearly when the announcement of the CC was by General Security, they say the place is Geneva. They are playing for the place now almost 2 years. They don't want to come to Geneva, and they're trying to, playing on the place of meeting of the CC.
All right, well, while this continues, this political stalemate, the humanitarian situation is deteriorating quite rapidly. Mohanad Hadi, you are the UN's regional humanitarian coordinator for Syria, for the Syria crisis. According to UNHCR's recent report, which was published just last month, in fact, this month, an estimated 90% of the population lives in poverty. Almost 13 million are food insecure, 7 million are internally displaced. The outlook for 2024, according to Martin Griffiths, the UN humanitarian chief, remains bleak. The conflict is hitting the 13-year mark, let's not forget. As Geir Peterson just outlined, hostilities continue across different parts of the country. Close to 17 million need humanitarian assistance. That's almost 10% more than the previous year. How sustainable is this situation? And how do you fill the gap? Because as we mentioned earlier, international aid is also drying up. Who can step in to help, given this stalemate that we see?
Thanks. I don't want to lose my friends on my right side here, but I have to say that we as humanitarians are dealing with the results of failed politics. Yeah. I mean, I'm looking at this, it says Antalya Diplomacy Forum, and if the diplomacy was doing the job it's supposed to be doing, I'm not supposed to be sitting here, by the way, because the politicians could have found the solution. And people sometimes get the situation in Syria mixed up. The solution for Syria is a political solution. It's not a humanitarian solution. And everybody now is focusing and has been focusing since day one on the humanitarian solution. And it's not a solution, it's a band-aid remedy. This is what we're doing. The people of Syria need an end to this conflict. What we do as humanitarians is basically try to keep people alive, to help them until a solution is found. As you rightly said, almost 17 million people are in need of aid. Syria is the biggest appeal when it comes to the humanitarian asks. It was last year, and probably it will be this year. And unfortunately, as you and Geir has said, the humanitarian needs are increasing, yet we are getting less donor support. Of course, we're grateful for all the support we've been getting over the past years, but the needs are increasing, and there are other crises around the world, and we are competing with Yemen, with Somalia, and we're competing with Gaza and with Africa, and we can't prioritize one child over the other. But the fact is, Syrian people are becoming more and more desperate. And it's not just about food, People think that when people are in need, they talk about food. No, we're talking about food, education. We're talking about no lost generation here, which we're losing it. We're talking about protection issue, gender-based violence, protection of women and children. All of those issues are desperate and in need for the population in Syria. Any civil servant in Syria gets less than $30 maximum. This is like an inflated number even. How are families supposed to survive? How are households are expected to meet the needs of their children? We're not even talking about healthcare here. So no matter how you look at it, it's really not looking optimistic, at least for humanitarians. We're getting more and more depressed year after year after year. And I have to tell you, a direct answer to your question, who do we get engaged? I don't know. We've almost knocked every door asking for more aid. Sometimes, honestly, it's becoming difficult to get audience with some donors because we told them all the stories. We've shared with them the suffering of the people. We shared with them the agony of the women and children, the displaced people, the lost generation that we have. Yet, I have to remind people all the time, humanitarian solution is not the solution here. The solution is a political solution to end the crisis for the Syrian people.
But looking at the humanitarian situation, a lot of criticism is often leveled at humanitarian operations inside Syria, at least by the Syrian authorities, that it is, they often argue that it is overly politicized. Do you agree with this?
I mean, everybody tries to politicize the humanitarian work, not just in Syria, all over the world. I think we've been doing a good job in trying to depoliticize the situation, the humanitarian work. We make no difference between somebody living in northeast, northwest, south of Syria. We don't have this good citizen, bad citizen approach. We've always kept our neutrality. I think this is what's keeping us going in Syria for over 12 years. I think all the humanitarians have done an outstanding job maneuvering through those political challenges. I mean, every time I get dragged into politics, I point at Geir and I say, please, those questions, ask Geir, don't bring them to us. Our focus is women and children. Our focus is the humanitarian. I'm not at all, I mean, we want a political solution, but I cannot drag myself or my colleagues into the political saga that keeps on going.
But how do you explain that the humanitarian plan for Syria, at least last year's, was only 33% funded? I mean, clearly, there is a very selective approach to what the so-called international community is doing for Syria. WFP has reduced its assistance to just 40% of those receiving it. So again, the question is, who steps in? Are regional governments trying to help?
Well, we've been asking everybody to step in, and I'm actually explaining to people that supporting Syria is no longer a deed, it's a need. As my colleagues have said, unless a political solution in Syria is found, the entire region will remain unstable. So it's not just feeling good, supporting the population of Syria, supporting the Syrians in need, it shouldn't just make people feel good about it. It's not like we've done our deed for the day and yes, way to go. I think it's the responsibility of the international community, it's the responsibility of the regional countries to continue supporting the Syrian humanitarian operations until a solution is found.
All right, we keep hearing about the need for a diplomatic, political solution to this crisis. Rich Outzen, you are a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council here in Turkey. How much can you resolve one issue if the other is stuck? In other words, how important is it to move the political process forward? To what extent are the big powers, and I'm thinking the United States, but others as well, a hindrance here?
Well, it's good to be with you, and I appreciate the remarks of my distinguished fellow panelists. As a former military man, it may not surprise you that my view is that both politics, diplomacy, and humanitarian assistance are all downstream from security and order decisions. And I think the fundamental reason that the Syrian conflict and the suffering of the Syrian people continues today is that wrong decisions were made and wrong actions were taken with regards to the security and order aspects of this. So I'll take on the mea culpa on behalf of U.S. statecraft in this regard. There were certain understandings and certain analyses taken early in 2010, 2011, 2012 as the Syrian revolution developed that basically asserted that this was going to flow naturally and organically, that there was nothing that could prevent the fall of Assad, and that with a little bit of a push in the region and to the Syrian opposition, it would all happen. This reflected a paradigm that died slowly in the West that basically said there is a common security understanding among the West, that we have globalization of security going on, that nobody could possibly want a man like Assad to stay in power, and that nobody would see it in their interests to go to the mat to support him. Well, that was wrong. That was wrong because the United States was not unopposed in this region in trying to have its own vision of collective security and a US-led order. In fact, the revanchist and revisionist thinkers in Moscow and Tehran very much were not going to let Assad fall. And the problem with looking at this conflict, even today, 10, 12 years on, is that this is not just about Syrians and Syrians, because the Assad regime has, for decades now, been in the pockets of the IRGC and been very deeply under the influence of Tehran and could not have stood on its own against the Syrian opposition without direct and massive military intervention by Russia. Now, unfortunately, I think that having made that assessment that this would flow naturally and that the forces of good in Syria, so to speak, were unopposed, that was an object lesson that Moscow certainly took to heart and is reflected in what they ended up doing in Ukraine in 2014 and in 2022. So we have a crisis of world order that's still unsolved, that started to some extent with the misplaying of the Syrian crisis. Now, I don't want to be entirely negative about this. The politics are not impossible. They are, in fact, downstream, but I've long felt, as has many of the people that I've worked with in the U.S. on this issue, that the proper amount of pressure imposed upon the Damascus regime would be the necessary condition for meaningful negotiations. That includes economic pressure, that includes military pressure, that includes diplomatic pressure. I think with the other crises going on in the region, which you've spoken about, Gaza, which of course tears at the hearts of everyone here, as well as Ukraine, it's hard to focus on that. But on the other hand, there are no signs that the West, the United States or Europe, are willing to simply let Assad win. So this is not a foregone conclusion. Normalization has failed. The idea that Damascus was simply going to wash its hands of all the crimes it had committed against its own people and regionally, the criminal activity, the terror activity, that this would just be allowed to be washed away in the sands of time and that normalization would occur, I think has been proven false. Unfortunately, policy moves slowly in Washington and the West. I'll just conclude this portion by saying I retain hope because of something that in policy world is referred to as the punctuated equilibrium theory. And it basically says that policy systems, especially in democracies, stay in a state of stasis until there's a shocking event. Once that shocking event happens, then real change occurs. We're still in a period of stasis in Washington because the price is inflicted mostly on other people, the Syrian people, and the costs of getting engaged are still politically high for Democrats or Republicans. But there will come a day when there is this punctuating event, whether it's another humanitarian disaster or the fall of the regime from its own internal pressures, that will prompt a renewed focus on this. For the time being, we have a very ugly, but not necessarily unsustainable status quo there will be a punctuation. The United States will get more interested and involved with this and will catalyze international action at some point. By the way, this can only happen effectively if we do so with Turkey, which is obviously a massive player in the Syrian equation because of its geography, because of its hosting of over 4 million Syrians, because of its efforts to provide relief and security for Syrians in the north. It's hard to think how the United States, how Washington and Ankara thread the needle to get to cooperation, but I assure you it is easier to imagine that happening than to imagine Assad figuring out a way to run this country again.
Well, there are the competing dynamics, as you say, and interests of the big powers, the United States, Russia, and others. But you did say that wrong decisions have been made. Now, in 2021, Joe Biden did, for a moment, ask for a review of US policy, and very quickly seems to have caved in to some Israeli pressure. It seems to keep some of the main US military bases in Syria. Al-Tanf comes to mind, after he had decided, or Trump had decided previously, that it may be time to close that base. You've mentioned that Assad has held on to power all this time, so whoever had bet on him leaving or being driven out has been proven wrong so far. The United States seems to have given up on the idea of overthrowing him, and has for a while now, for several years. He has come out of isolation, found a way to reestablish Syria within the Arab League, to the dismay of the opposition, and regardless of how some Arab nations have felt about this. But nonetheless, how would you perceive US policy towards Syria today? Why is the US keeping such a military presence in the country, if not for Israel's sake? Then why? Because they do make for attractive targets, don't they?
Yeah, well, that's right. There is a tension between the desire not to take the hand off the steering wheel, so to speak, on two things. The first is counter ISIS, de-ISIS, because the Islamic State still is conducting attacks. I think there were a dozen or 2 dozen truffle hunters killed in the Badia last week. ISIS remains capable of carrying out terror attacks. This is a serious issue for the United States. Whether it justifies keeping the 900 troops there is a matter for critical analysis, but believe me, in Washington it is still considered a risk that ISIS, which is active in Africa and other places, will still have the ability to resurge in Syria. So a president, as President Biden has done, who's already led a withdrawal from one major military commitment in Afghanistan, is loath, certainly before an election, to approach that again in a second place. So I don't see him pulling out of Syria before that. But I don't think it's just because Israel would like us to stay at Al-Tanf. I think it's a concern that there not be an ISIS resurgence. It's for also the idea that there may be some deterrent value to Iranian activities in the region other than against Israel, because if the pieces of Syria are going to be put back into a workable state at some point, Iranian influence over the military forces, the intelligence, and the economy has to be lessened or limited. So, Iranian hegemony in Syria is not compatible with Syrian sovereignty. We may not be preventing that entirely at this point, but for us to leave entirely would also facilitate it. So I think there's
Is oil another reason?
Say again?
Is oil another reason, as some suggest?
Well, there's not much oil there, and it's not of very high quality, and from what I understand, most of it's being sold to Assad. So, look, oil's never not an issue, but that's not one of the primary drivers of why we're staying in Syria.
Geir Peterson, how do you view all of this in the wake of what you've heard here on stage today?
I think we all agree sort of about the description of the realities on the ground. But I think we need also to remind ourselves that this conflict has gone, what I would call, through at least 3 to 4 phases. Let me very briefly just highlight them. So from 2011 to 2015 is basically what I would call the regime change phase from the international community. Then we had the Russian intervention, and we had a period loosely from late 2015 until March 2020, where I do believe the Russians, the Iranians, and the government in Damascus believed they were going to win this militarily. Then we had a very important event that happened in March 2020. Was a ceasefire agreement between Russia and Turkey And then at the same time, we had some understandings between Turkey and the United States. Before March 2020, the longest period in Syria where front lines hadn't changed, 3 weeks. 3 weeks. After March 2020, front lines have not changed. They have not changed. This is a dramatic development. And still today, of course, we have too many people being killed. But if you look at the history of the conflict, it's been a dramatic reduction of people being killed. So why am I saying this? Because I think what happened in March 2020 was a realization from all the different actors that actually what they were sort of saying in public was actually true, that no one can win this militarily. You need a political way out of this crisis. But the problem here is that instead of moving forward in a manner that meets what I said, that you address all the different components of the crisis, the political, the socio-economic, and the security, the question of sovereignty, Turkish withdrawal, the question of American withdrawal, what happens on the borders, the fight against Daesh, what happens with HDS, Nusra, all of these questions. As I said, it can only be solved if all the key actors, and I'm sorry to repeat myself, but that's the reality, that's the hard reality. And if these actors are not willing to compromise, then the problem is we can enter into another 12, 13 years of war and conflict. But then the question becomes, when will it explode again? That becomes the question.
Well, let me ask you then, how much of a key actor is Bashar al-Assad today? We heard Badr Jamous say that the opposition does not have a partner in Syria, that Assad is unwilling to negotiate. You could argue because he feels he may have the upper hand, if it is true that he does control an estimated 70% of the territory, has the strong support of Russia and Iran. Can you corroborate what Badr Jamous has just said, that Assad isn't willing to cooperate? Have you been in touch with him directly recently? Have you been in touch with him?
So let me put it like this. When I'm in Damascus, the story is a little bit different from what I'm hearing here today. And Damascus, of course, is arguing that it's the opposition, it's the Americans, it's the Turks, it's the Israelis that's really the problem. And that the focus should be on getting rid of the Turkish occupation, the American occupation, and then the fight against Daesh. And that is the priority. And then there is a lot of debate about how representative the opposition is. But here, this is what is important. So yes, the opposition has their complaints about Damascus. Damascus has their complaints about the opposition. But the point is, we need the two to work together. So when I sit down in Damascus, my focus is on getting Damascus to move forward. When I'm sitting down with the SNC, my focus is on getting them to move forward together. But as I said, and as I'm telling both the opposition and Damascus is, you start moving forward, and then hopefully I can get the Iranians, the Turks, the Russians, and the Americans to move forward together. Don't sit and wait for each other's, because this is what is happening today. So Assad is sitting waiting for others, hoping that things can move forward, as it did with the Arab rapprochement. But the question is no longer about winning the war, it's about winning the peace. And this is the challenge for Damascus, for Assad, it's a challenge for the SNC, and it's a challenge for all the international actors. And that is, in my opinion, is really what is lacking today. The focus on how can we win the peace.
Not sure you answered my question directly, though. Do you believe that Assad is a major obstacle, as the opposition is suggesting? Have you been in touch with him directly recently?
Listen, I think I gave a very good answer to your question.
But yes or no, do you believe that he is an obstacle? I know what the opposition thinks and what others might say.
Yes, and you just heard what I think.
Which is yes or no.
Thank you.
All right. All right, in a very diplomatic fashion. Badr Jamous, you just heard what Geir Pedersen said. There's a lot of blame to go around.
يعني
The government believes you are actually not negotiating in good faith.
I think Mr. Geir, he knows the situation very well, and maybe he cannot say that now. He knows very well that the opposition always was coming positive. We had 8 rounds of CC. He was mediator, and he saw that we always was positive, and the negative was from the regime side. Now we already 2 years we cannot have meeting of the CC. This for the regime refusing, not me refusing. We always say we accept to go to Geneva to start a negotiation about CC and about the other basket. So who's refusing all this? So we have to be clear on this. This is our maybe compliment about the UN. They have to see very clear, not put us in the front of the international committee and Syrian people, that we are in the same page with the regime. We are accepting to go and implement 2254 and negotiate about 2254. We are trying, we are pushing, we are helping, we are talking to everybody about that because we know how's our people suffering, and every day more and more. We have more and more refugees, we have more and more detainees, we have a lot of problems every day, more and more. So we are ready to negotiate, we are ready to implement 2254, but in reality, he know, and all the Mr. de Mistura, Mr. Ibrahimi, Mr. Kofi Annan, they say very clear this one, of course, after they realize. So the problem in the regime side. So I understand now he's mediator and he have to play this role, but reality is reality. We, of course, I understand what he started to say from 2015, who accept Russia to come to Syria. We know, everybody know that. We, of course, know how Turkey helped the Syrian people and go inside Syria to protect the Syrian people. Today we have 8 million Syrians under the Turkish support. Can we imagine if Turkey, they didn't do that, what's happening? You know how many million of Syrian refugees today in the world. So they take responsibility for all the international committee about this 8 million Syrian. But again, questions where the other countries, where the international committee about this conflict. So I think everybody, all countries, they know the situation, the problem. Each month, I think Mr. Geir Pedersen, he make briefing to the Security Council, and he say it's Syrian talks. So why we are talking about Russia, America, Turkey? No, I think the question is clear. Why the regime he don't want to come to Geneva? Why the regime he don't want to go to the other basket? Why the regime he don't want to go to negotiate about detainees? We have 100,000 of detainees. Where? I hope it's clear.
It's clear but complicated. Mohamed Hadi, how does this leave you and how you're able to implement your role on the humanitarian level? I think you made it clear to begin with. The political stalemate doesn't help you.
No, it doesn't help us at all. And it breaks my heart that every time, you know, I hear about Syria and there is no solution. I mean, Geir, I think if you put your job for auction, nobody's going to bid. We all know that. You have the most complex job in the world, I think. But for us, we still have hope because this is what we're offering the Syrian people. Without hope, I don't think we can even continue the work that we are doing. And again, you know, I hear what you're saying about the stalemate, about how DC and other capitals see this. But what does it take? I mean, we had a serious lack of funding many years ago, and then we saw a wave of refugees made it to Europe, and then suddenly the world woke up and said, no, we want to support the Syrian people. We've even done the math for some member states and told them how it was more efficient, effective, practical to support the Syrians where they are in Syria. We just showed them how much it costs to support a displaced Syrian in Syria compared to him or her when they become a refugee in Germany or in the rest of the world. The problem is we've tried all the tricks in the book to make sure that the Syrians are continue to being supported. And as I said earlier, we're also getting disappointed because we don't see this moving forward. We see more and more suffering among the Syrian people. And we're getting to a point, I mean, we even stopped talking about negative coping mechanism. We're beyond that. You know, we're way beyond that. I'm afraid we are becoming at a no turning point for the Syrian people when it comes to development, to the future of those Syrian people. With no education, with no protection for women and children, with lack of nutrition, all of those are red flags for us. And what are we waiting for? We're waiting for the political solution. I gave an example to, and then again, the more, when we don't have a political solution, people keep on focusing on the humanitarian solution. And my answer to this, we humanitarians, you need to look at us as nurses. We're not doctors. We cannot cure the patient. We deal with the symptoms of the sickness. We just keep the patient alive. We don't write the prescription. The prescription comes from GEAR, from others, to find a political solution. And unless the doctor does their job, the doctors do their job, which are the politicians here, we're stuck. We're just becoming frustrated, just like the people.
Dr. Peterson, not sure you have the prescription, but let me just quickly, you may surprise me. You do. In a nutshell, before I go back to Rich.
We do have the description. The problem is that there are so many patients that are not listening. They're not really willing to take the medicine. That's the challenge.
Well, I keep asking you, who is the key patient? You don't give me a clear answer. So let me ask Rich Outzen. There are too many patients, and there are too many countries in the region and further afield that have serious interest in what goes on. Here we are in Turkey, shares a 900-kilometer border with Syria. Over 3 million refugees from Syria are here in Turkey. We saw how the competing dynamics on the ground between different military forces has turned into a potential flashpoint. In October, the US shot down a Turkish drone in the northeastern part of the country, saying it was a potential threat to troops there. I wonder how much do these competing dynamics between countries like the United States and Turkey and others further complicate this situation?
I think that they're the most easily solved element in the equation. I think if you take a step back at what the possible outcomes are moving forward over the next 3 to 5 years, a lot of it depends, because I think the world has generally come to the conclusion, the civilized world, that what Assad did is wrong, and that this sort of killing 500,000 of your own people, driving 8 million from their homes, probably should not just be nodded at by the international community. That leads us then to the question, can he be successfully coerced into making concessions? If the answer is yes, then the solution should be apply more pressure. If the answer is no, he cannot be successfully coerced because the international community doesn't care enough, or because there's too many other things going on, or because Iran and Russia are strong enough. That does not lead to normalization. That leads then to the improvement of the current status quo by taking the pieces that are out of his control, primarily the Northeast and the Northwest, and finding ways to make them safer, more secure, more prosperous, more functional. That can be done, because when the political object lesson is given that Syria can work, it just can't work under Assad, then you will see real political compromise emerge. And this set of problems between the US and Turkey, to make it very, very simple, because we are the predominant helper in the Northeast and Turkey in the North and Northwest, while it's difficult, I think is more easily solved than the other things we've talked about. So that's what I think this heads to ultimately, is a de facto modus vivendi between the Northeast and the Northwest that emerges, or causes to emerge, functional Syria, and that functional Syria makes the archipelago of Assad-controlled Syria unsustainable in the long run.
Let me ask you briefly, before I take a few questions from the floor, to what extent is US policy towards Syria, towards the region in general, made at the behest of its strong ally, Israel? In other words, is it in Israel's interest to see a stable, resurgent, strong Syria?
Yeah, so the US policy is made not in a rational, continuous, systematic manner on any foreign policy issue. And I'm not aware of any single foreign policy issue in which any partner of ours, even the closest, Israel being one of them, the United Kingdom, others, are given a carte blanche veto or shaping authority. So
but on Israel, it seems to be ironclad.
On Israel, when it comes to the issue of Israel's security, that's about as close as you can get to ironclad, because that affects large elements of our voting public on the left and on the right. That said, Israel has no carte blanche over the rest of our regional policy. That's made because of our own wisdom or our own foolishness in different cases. So what I would say we're seeing with regards to Syria is policy making that is on sort of a glide path because no one wants to incur political risk or commit new resources to it. So it is sort of on terminal guidance. Something is going to have to shock the system for it to change. Nobody wants to incur that in an election year, but it's not because of an Israeli veto or carte blanche. It's because of a system that's sort of lethargic right now and needs to be shocked into new and creative thinking.
And the status quo seems to be working for too many. Do we have a few questions from the floor? Please go ahead. I'm not sure if we have a microphone, do we? Here at the front, please. If you could keep your question brief, we've got just a few minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Farhi. I would ask one question to two speakers. None of the speakers mentioned even one word about YPG. I would ask about the YPG in the region, and in my opinion, unless the YPG and a terrorist organization such as YPG and the Daesh disappear in the region, there won't be any political solution in Syria. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, there is a general belief, very firm belief among Turkish public opinion, the United States is the main supporter of YPG and Daesh.
Would you like to take this question, Geir Peterson?
Thank you. It's good to have friends. Listen, I need to make a distinction. And that is that we're operating within the UN system with what we call UN-listed terrorist groups. And in Syria, we have basically two. It's Daesh, and it's HDS, or Nusra, as it used to be called. Then we have the challenge of the situation in the northeast, where obviously we have a situation, as you rightly pointed out, where the Americans are supporting whatever we want to call it, SDF or YPG or PKK or whatever it is. And that is a reality on the ground. It's a de facto authority on the ground. Then we have in the northwest, we have another de facto authority, that is Nusra, and then we have, to the north, we have SIG, the Syrian interim government. So we basically have four different areas. So we have the government, we have Nusra, we have SIG, and we have YPG, or whatever we want to call it. So obviously, when I'm saying we need to involve all actors in the process, I say we need Turkey, we need the Americans, meaning, of course, I'm addressing this issue. It needs to be addressed. Do I have a solution to that issue? No, I don't. But it needs to be on the table, and it needs to be discussed, obviously between the Americans and YPG and between the Americans and Turkey. That's the only way out of this. The whole situation in the Northwest is a bit more complicated, and we can go into that in the next panel.
How should it be addressed, though?
The reality today is that in this area, we have a lot of IDPs. So in the area, most probably approximately, closer to 2 million internally displaced people. So obviously you need a solution that is, it can't only be a military solution to this issue. It needs also to be a political part of that process. Because why am I saying that? Because you don't want a situation where 2 million people are on the move again. And that would be the consequences if you have a purely military approach to this issue. And that can be in no one's interest. I do believe that this is a major challenge if you're talking long-term, how the situation in the Northwest is to be sorted out. And there is absolutely no easy way out. It's just part of the complexities. But this shouldn't stop us from addressing the other issues that we can address. That's a long answer to a short but complicated question.
Do we have another question for someone other than Geir Peterson? Let's see. Leaving you off the hook.
Thank you very much for this very this very nice and also very illuminating meetings are. But the real question of the problem, in my opinion, is religion and Islam. Do you think that the Sunni Syria, which in majority, as you know, will then become a complicated question under the influence of the Ikhwan Muslimin for all the Arabs and Israel? And this is the reason why they are keeping the regime, actual regime in power, and they are not going in details of the problems. Do you think this view is correct or incorrect? Thank you.
Badr Jamos, would you like to take this question, the religious sectarian dimension?
Firstly, I would like also to answer for the ladies, BKK or BYJ, for the Syrian is a terrorist organization. It's refusing from all Syrian, even in the northeast, Kurd or Arab or Turkmen or Assyrian. So, of course, this is one of the big problem also coming to us from outside. They are not Syrian, the head of all this organization. We know how these people. So this is clear for us like opposition. For your questions about the brothers Muslim or Ikhwan Muslimin, I don't think the problem of Israel coming just from the brothers Muslim. So, almost the Syrian opposition today, not from today, from 2014 in the table, the Ikhwan Muslimin or brother Muslim, there was, not less than 10% of the opposition, the whole opposition. So we are clear about future of Syria. We put our future of Syria, democratic state. We are not talking about Islamic State or Ikhwan Muslimin state. So it's questions, I think, media questions more than reality. So in the reality, all our papers which put it in the table of the UN from 2014, it was very clear. We are talking about democratic state. We are not talking about Islamic State or give the brother Muslim more than they have in the election. So even in the election, we believe that maybe they don't have even 10% from the Syria. So I don't think the problem is coming from the Ikhwan Muslimin.
All right. Well, in just the last couple of minutes that we have, can I just go around the panel and get your final thoughts, starting with you, Rich Outzen. The topic of discussion today was the road to stability in Syria. Where are we down that road, in a nutshell? Your final thoughts.
My final thought is that we have a very unfortunate type of stability right now. And that's sustainable for Assad. And until there's collective action, starting with the United States and Turkey, who have some good things going on in the bilateral relationship recently, and perhaps this opens the door for other types of coordination and cooperation moving forward. Once those two have consensus, it becomes a powerful motor for change. This current stability cannot be allowed to pertain because it is too damaging to the refugees, to the US interest, to the Turkish interest, to humanitarian interests. And I hope that there will be a window of opportunity for that. So I seek not stability in the case of Syria, at least not the false stability built upon allowing Assad to do what he has done, but a new and a better stability that will come after a new round of collective action, and I think that will be possible, hopefully while Geir is still on the job.
Mohammed Hadi, how far down the road are we? Are we stuck? Are we moving forward or potentially backward?
When it comes to the humanitarian situation, we are moving backward. I think we got to a stage where supporting the humanitarian work is not just to meet the needs of the people, it's more of a crisis prevention. Because we have seen in Syria, and from a very early stage, wherever the humanitarians could not fill a gap, somebody else, for all the wrong reasons, came and filled that gap. We saw how ISIS took advantage of our absence in many places. We see everywhere around the world, when humanitarian needs of the people are not met, there is somebody with an evil agenda who comes and occupies that, fills that gap, but with consequences that not impact the country, but impact the region, and it's impacting for the entire world, impacting the entire world. And that's why I'm saying supporting the humanitarian needs in Syria, crisis prevention, call it whatever you want to call it, but it will create crisis for all of us globally if the needs are not met.
Badr Jamous, is this a complete breakdown, or are we moving in any direction?
Firstly, actually, like this forum, it will help us to have like talks and lobbying inside like this diplomacy forum. We are continuous our job until we bring solution to the Syrian people and implement the UN resolution. We believe that we are partner with the UN. We are trying and pushing to help Mr. Geir to bring a solution. Of course, it's difficult, very difficult, but we are very flexible. We are trying really to talk to the countries, to all countries which he's mentioned, to help to bring a meeting or to bring to the table to have a solution.
On this note, a solution, Geir Peterson, how do you see it? What type of vehicle are we driving?
Let me start by saying we need a couple of things to start with. We need what I call a de-escalation, a containment of the current crisis so that the war in Gaza doesn't continue to spill over into Syria. That's sort of the first we need. Then we need, as Mohammed has said, we need increased humanitarian assistance so that in all the different areas, things do not continue to collapse. That's it. And then thirdly, we need to start meeting again within the Constitutional Committee. But as I've always said, the Constitutional Committee in itself cannot solve the Syrian crisis, but it's a place for the opposition and the government to meet and try to develop some common positions. Then we need, in addition to that, we need to start addressing all the different factors that is contributing to the crisis in Syria. We need, a broader approach to the political process. We need to address the question of sovereignty and independence of Syria. We need to discuss how the question of Turkish and American withdrawal is linked to the first question about the political process and the lack of a political process. We need to discuss security issues, the question of how to fight terrorism, how do we collectively do that in line with UN resolutions, protecting civilians. And then, of course, we need to discuss the issue of sanctions. Economic recovery, how is that possible? How can we move forward in all of this? And then there are many other issues, but let me just mention two. It's obviously the question about the detainees and the missing, and the question about the refugees and the internally displaced. And the reality is that without sort of addressing all of these issues that are interconnected, we will not really be able to move forward. But for now, containment, increased humanitarian assistance, and let's meet within the Constitutional Committee.
And the respect for international law,
Indeed.
something else that
Thank you. Yes.
we're not able to expand on. But for now, thank you all very much indeed, Geir Peterson, Badr Jamous, Mohammed Hadi, and Rich Outzen. Thank you for your fascinating insights, and thank you all very much for being with us.